Well, thank you very much, Edward, and thank you for inviting me here today to come and talk to you. My ideas are I'm going to discuss about not just leaving the EU, and I think we're all pretty much decided that we need to get out, but it's how exactly do we leave? What path should we follow? That's a very important question because, of course, there might be a referendum on that very same topic, and we need to be able to win it if indeed it does happen, and I think this is how we would do it. And one of the main ideas that I have centres on what's known as EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, and for me that is the way out. Now, if we're going to win a referendum, of course there would be pledges that we'll have to make to the public. Not everybody thinks like us. This is what I think we would need to do to win. We would need to reframe the debate, present Brexit as Britain leaving, as joining EFTA and keeping trade links, not about leaving them. If we're leaving the EU, then people think we might be missing out. We need to tackle the 3 million jobs myth. It's absolute bunkum, but it's still out there. It's been around since 2000, and it still keeps on getting repeated. One of the clearest ways of defeating that myth is by saying we'll keep full access to the single market and also protect businesses that benefit from access via the single market to Brussels and to the European Union itself. So we need to reassure businesses. And of course, if there isn't referendum, then of course we need to say that the result would be respected and we would be out as soon as possible. So any leaving the European Union needs to happen quickly, I would say within 2 years or less. That is actually very important because, of course, negotiations with the European Union on a withdrawal agreement or a future deal between Britain and what remains of the EU, the other 27 nations, could indeed take many, many years to agree, if ever. Therefore, we need a way that can deliver a quick way out. And for me, that is, of course, joining EFTA and remaining in the European Economic Area for the time being, which is essentially the single market. The European Economic Area is the single market and the internal market, as it's otherwise known in the EU documentation. That, of course, would be only as a transition. This is actually a first step to a new future. We would be out of the European Union. If Britain is already in the European Economic Area, but also a member of the European Union, I'm proposing that in the short term we would cancel our EU membership, remain in the European Economic Area, and then of course we'd reach a future deal with the European Union based upon that. But that is actually very important for a number of reasons. And this just sums up the whole process. This would take many years to achieve, but first of all, we'd win the referendum, if we have to have a referendum. We'd issue the Article 50 notification. There would be exit talks. We'd base that on retaining access to the European Economic Area. We would win EU support for our trade links. At the same time, we would rejoin EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. That will automatically have a rebalancing between the other EFTA states and the European Union. Currently in EFTA, there's Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. They're the main European Free Trade Association states. Britain was a founder member back in 1960. Unfortunately, we left in 1973 to join what became the EU. But of course, it's very important for us, for our future. Again, it's important to us in the past, and it can be important to our future. And eventually we replace the EEA agreement with a new European settlement, and that can, I think, have some dramatic changes. So this is really the whole process that I'm advocating, and this is not just important politically as a way of winning a referendum, as I'll explain later. It's also quite needed in terms of the economy and keeping trade links, because doing a trade deal with the European Union is not as straightforward as some would have us believe. This is currently the European settlement. You don't have to really take in this sort of diagram fully, but basically we have the European Union, we have the European Free Trade Association, we have the Schengen area, we have all these states within the Council of Europe. There are many different organisations within Europe at the moment. I'm proposing that we leave the EU and rejoin EFTA, And this is just a more simplified version of the two key aspects from that diagram. We've got the European Union and the European Free Trade Association. Currently, all EU states, bar Croatia, although it has a sort of shadow relationship and will be joining the European Economic Area, all EU states are in the European Economic Area, that's a single market, and as well as the EFTA states of Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. Basically, the European Economic Area is an agreement between EFTA and the EU, although Switzerland has chosen to duck out and follow its own path. Now, the basis of my talk is based on two books I wrote. One of them just happens to be here today, which no doubt you'll see me about afterwards. But of course, the first one is a book I wrote about how to deal with insurgency, and in a sense, we are an insurgency, so it's quite relevant. And the other one is about a book on the European Union. Now, as I mentioned, we're an insurgency. We're fighting for our independence, our country's independence, but also there's people within this country who think that they're serving the national interest by keeping us in the European Union. We need to understand that. There's people who genuinely believe that Britain is better off in the European Union and that they're doing the patriotic thing. Now, of course, they're just like in people in Scotland wanted independence, and there's other people in Scotland that wanted to keep the union together. Each side may have thought the others as traitors, but they all thought they were probably acting in their best interest. But of course, with an insurgency, we'd need to be very careful about ourselves and how we fight this battle, because throughout my studies of various conflicts and national liberation movements, it's often the insurgents themselves that can actually ruin any chance of victory by being too headstrong, by not accepting any compromise agreement, not accepting a transition. Throughout history, there's been many cases of where people who've been fighting for their freedom wouldn't accept a deal which would eventually lead to their independence, but instead followed their own path and had their own agenda and wanted to achieve their results straight away rather than following an incremental approach. So we need to, I think, bear that in mind. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the referendum. Now, Nick Clegg, on the now Deputy Prime Minister, said on the 15th of October 2003 that basically the longer the referendum is put off, the more chance there is of the Eurosceptics winning it and the other side losing it. I think that's very true. Of course, currently there's a referendum scheduled for 2017 that may or may not happen. There was a proposal advocated on Monday that there'd be a referendum as early as July 2015. For me, that is absolute madness, and that will lead to the defeat of the Eurosceptic movement and us losing the battle for a generation, just like we did in 1975. There was a bill trying to be put forward in Parliament, trying to have a referendum for this year, 2014. That was put down by Adam Afriyie. He had the right intentions, but of course, if there were to have been a referendum, I have no doubt in believing if there's a referendum at this moment in time, we would lose. We don't have an organisation set up. We don't even have a full agenda, rather than we want out of the European Union, but what happens next? Some Eurosceptics can answer that question, some with certainty or with varying degrees of certainty, others not. We know we want out of the European Union, but what next? We need to answer that question if we're going to win, because if there is to be a referendum, there'd be one side saying, well, we can stay in, we know what we're going to get, and the alternative is, not many people can name what that alternative would be, certainly not with any certainty. So basically, the longer they leave the referendum, it's the more likely that we'll win, the more likely that we will be organised, more likely that the Europhiles will be discredited, and we'll have more time to win over businesses and the population to our side. Now, of course, this follows on with, even Mao Zedong would be on my side now, the former leader of China. He wrote on protracted war that, of course, if you're going to be fighting a guerrilla war, an insurgency, then of course, first of all, you need to whittle down the other side's forces till you have parity and then engage them in a conventional confrontation. At the moment, we're still in the process of whittling down the sides of the Europhiles. We're not quite strong enough, I think, to engage in a referendum just yet. That is my analogy for for this whole sort of battle. A referendum would be like a conventional battle. We'd be against the main political parties, we'd be against big businesses, we'd be against the main trade unions, we'd be against the BBC. Most of the media, apart from the Express, all other newspapers support Britain's EU membership, some with varying degrees of scepticism, but even the Mail is still wedded to the idea of Britain staying in. Really, are we there to have a referendum? I don't think so, not just yet.
Could I ask a question?
There will be questions at the end, so possibly best to come at the end. Please take notes and I will be very happy to take any questions. Now, of course, leaving, we would have to follow the Article 50 route. That's laid down, that's the law of this country. It passed through the House of Commons when the Lisbon Treaty was put through. Now, that has benefits. Notice can be given by royal prerogative. You don't actually need an Act of Parliament to initiate an Article 50 notification. Forces the EU to begin negotiations with Britain. Otherwise, there is no mechanism for Britain to renegotiate its relationship or to have any discussions with the European Union. They don't have to sit at the table with us to discuss what Britain would want when we're out of the European Union. Article 50 forces them to do that. And of course, withdrawal can actually take place within less than 2 years if a withdrawal agreement has been achieved. Of course, you don't need a withdrawal agreement to leave, but of course, if there is one that has been agreed, then it could in theory be within months or perhaps even weeks. Although there's a lot to discuss, so I think it would take longer than that. But there's difficulties as well. The EU, to extend the time frame for an Article 50 notification, it can be vetoed by another member of state. So name a country in the European Union, France or Estonia or Denmark could veto Britain extending the Article 50 2-year negotiation period. So it would be thrown out of the European Union even if we hadn't reached an agreement. That could have problems for trade because there'd be no trade agreement reached. And of course the EU has a stronger negotiating position under the Article 50 procedure, and an absolute majority of MEPs will need to be needed to vote through the withdrawal agreement. That could be very difficult because the MEPs, they don't really have a constituency to answer to. They're elected by people within an area, but if people lose their jobs as a result of poor EU policies, well, it doesn't really affect the MEPs in any way. So it'd be very difficult to get through a withdrawal agreement through the European Parliament that would be completely one-sided towards the Britain's interests. Very unlikely that the European Parliament would vote for that. They're into flexing their muscles. Earlier, over 2 years ago, they rejected the European budget. They want to push round, they want to show that they have their own voice, and I think having a withdrawal agreement that's completely one-sided towards Britain will actually not be deliverable, certainly not within 2 years. Now, a lot of Eurosceptics say what they want from the European Union is want to leave the European Union and have a free trade agreement. That sounds fair, doesn't it? Well, the European Union, when it comes to free trade, that's actually a bit of a myth. It's not so quite straightforward. The EU has trade agreements, but many of those seek to export its regulations. They have conditionality. A country can have free access to the EU's single market if it enforces various rules in various areas. That is something that the EU does. That's not free. There's always bureaucratic compliance if you're going to be exporting to the European Union. At the moment, we're in the EU. If we want to send our goods to another EU country, it's completely straightforward. If, of course, we were outside, there'd need to be form filling, there'd need to be compliance with rules of origin, generating more form filling. It'd have to go through designated port of entries. I'll come to all that later. I mentioned already EU trade agreements demanding compliance with EU standards. And of course, for the EU, trade isn't just about the exchange of goods or services. It's often about they will open up their market if other countries adopt not just EU rules, EU environmental standards, and in increasing amount of cases, EU human rights rules. That's one of the main areas that the EU is now beginning to add on to its trade agreements. So this is how I see things. at the moment, many rules are, of course, made by the European Union, many actually initiated by what I call UN-sponsored standard-setting agencies, such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Dr. Richard North, who gives similar talks, and he details how actually a lot of legislation now comes from those bodies, but they often will set rules which are then adopted by the European Union that then automatically apply to EU member states. But of course, in many cases, the EU will then be telling free trade partners, you must adopt these rules, you must follow these standards if you're going to have access to a full access without tariffs to our single market. This is something which is increasingly happening, and it's very different to the language that we're used to, because we're often saying, let's cancel our EU membership and just replace it with a free trade agreement. Well, it's never as simple as that. Of course, trade with the EU needs to go through a designated port of entry if you're exporting to the EU from outside. There would be tariffs being applied. Now, of course, they're minimal in certain areas, but Britain would need to have its tariffs agreed with the European Union. We'd need to have our trade policy agreed with the WTO. At the moment, we don't have a seat at the WTO, so our trade schedules haven't been agreed by them. There'd be rules of origin compliance, very bureaucratic. We could be facing anti-dumping action. Often, if a country wants to export to the European Union and the EU wants to protect its producers, it will say to the producer that's trying to export, we think you're selling it too cheaply, we're going to fine you, we think you're subsidising it. There may be absolutely no proof for that, but in cases the EU will take what's known as anti-dumping action, where they will add extra tariffs onto an exporter, which will force up the prices. And just the threat of that often has the effect that the EU wants, is that an exporter will put on extra prices so it avoids the anti-dumping action. They often do this, some people think for political reasons, such as they'll target Chinese solar panels, but they're not targeting solar panels from Malaysia. This can often result in a trade war. But this is another way of showing that the EU, when it comes to trade, it is actually sometimes quite a bully. It puts tariffs against certain countries, puts anti-dumping action against others, and uses its own rules to force out other producers to try and protect its own companies. And of course, the EU will not grant access to the services market or public procurement. That is very rare that they would do so. The only way that can be done is via being in the European Economic Area. Currently, we hear about Switzerland having free trade agreements with the European Union. Well, they do in goods if they comply with EU standards, but of course they don't in terms of services. If a Swiss company wants to sell its services to the European Union, it needs to do so via setting up a subsidiary within the European Economic Area. That's a way they get round EU protection of services, but of course it's cumbersome. It's not easy. Of course, a large multinational can handle it, but of course a smaller supplier of services will have difficulty. I think that's a very important point, the issue of the services market, because in Britain we have the City of London, and if it's not for the City of London, this country would be bust. We've been living off exporting or selling services for many years now, and that's been the whole growth of the economy largely over 40 years. That's now beginning to suffer, but it's still very important, and the city would want to know that it has the full access to the services market. The city is much more than financial services. It's also international business services, lawyers, communications companies, many different aspects that deal with public affairs and public relations, all different things that help businesses. And the EU would not give full access to the services market unless there's some special deal, or of course, unless a country is a member of the European Economic Area. This is just to show how important it is. This is the red line. This is Britain's trade deficit in terms of goods. It's a massive deficit. The blue line is the trade in services. It is a surplus for us, and that means that our trade deficit with the EU isn't so bad, but it's very important to us, And we often talk about, well, we have a trade deficit with the European Union. They sell us more than we sell them. Therefore, they'll want to keep access to our market. Well, that's partly true. But of course, we sell more services to them than they sell to us. So there's somewhere where they've got the whip hand over us in any negotiations. And of course, there's also the issue that, well, since 1973, the EU has been negotiating trade agreements for the whole of the European Union, including Britain. If Britain left the EU, many of those trade agreements will become void. Again, Richard North has done excellent analysis in this. There's over 700 of them, ranging from goods to air passenger travel. They would be void. Many of those, if we left the European Union, because they apply to the EU and only to EU members. So we would need a special arrangement with the European Union where we could keep that, because at the moment that would then cause a great deal of difficulty. If we just left and those agreements become null and void, then a whole host of things would stop overnight, and 700 agreements would take a long time to be renegotiated or, of course, to be rubber stamped. Even that would take time to go through the process, which would leave uncertainty for business. And if they realise that and there's a referendum, then they will err heavily on the status quo, because businesses generally don't like change. This is just an example of some of the trade agreements that are in place. Some of them are being negotiated, but the EU does have a great deal of them around the world and discussions with many other nations. So that's what we would be missing out on if we left overnight tomorrow, which does sound good, but it would create problems. Now, just coming back to the issue of the referendum, we're all on side. We know we want out of the European Union. Many people in the opinion polls think the same, but I think the support for exit is actually quite soft. There's not a significant margin of those wanting to come out to defeat the fear campaign. Rest assured that if there were to be a referendum, there would be a whole host of businesses, world leaders coming out saying what a disaster it would be. Again, that's been referred to by Richard North as the FUD, the fear, uncertainty and doubt. People would be told they'd be losing their jobs. They would be told that the world outside would be very difficult. The sky will fall in. We saw what happened in the Scottish referendum. It was an orchestrated campaign that came out in the last few weeks, all planned, world leaders saying Scotland should stay in, Obama making his statements, banks saying they'll leave, everything would happen. I think it would have been very bad for Scotland, but of course it was really part of the campaign. We can expect exactly the same, and that's what happened in 1975 in Swindon. A major car manufacturer there wrote to all the employees saying, if you vote to leave, you could well lose your jobs. Of course, it probably wouldn't have happened. In fact, millions of job losses happened when we stayed in the European Union after 75. But people will be scared, and some people will err on the side of the status quo. And of course, the date of the referendum at the moment, 2017, is to coincide with the British presidency of the EU. That's where Britain takes on the administration for managing European Council meetings. It doesn't really give Britain any power. It gives duties upon the civil servants. But what it does give is the British Prime Minister and British ministers the right to sum up the conclusions of the of European meetings. It will make Britain look like they're winning in Europe. It will look like Britain's leading in Europe. David Cameron would be there, presuming if he's still Prime Minister, which definitely not certain, claiming that the council meeting had decided something that's thoroughly in Britain's interest, when of course that may not actually have been the case, but he would have that right to do so. People don't understand the workings of the EU. It's very arcane. They would see a British minister claiming that Britain's getting victories. They'd be summing up at these press conferences. It would make it look like Britain is having success. So that's why they've set on 2017, because that's the time when Britain can pretend it's leading in Europe. Now, we know that through opinion polling that the middle Wales is often what gets the most support. If, of course, there were to be a question, should Britain stay in the European Union, or should Britain leave the European Union, or Britain should stay in a reformed European Union. We know from polling, and I know this has been presented to David Cameron, that it's that middle option that gets most support. People would naturally err to it. That's why David Cameron, when he talks about a referendum, that's not to help us. That's, of course, well, partly to kill off UKIP, partly to shore up his own position with his rebellious MPs, some of which are no longer in the Conservative Party, so perhaps he shouldn't worry so much. But he knows that that's the best way of winning. It's that middle way option. That's where he always talks about the choice being leaving the EU or staying in a reformed European Union, because he knows that's what would deliver the most support. And all he needs to do is come up with some victory to claim that the EU's changed. They've done this before, such as over subsidiarity. This was won by John Major. He announced it was game, set and match. There was a new EU rule that decisions would then be taken at the lowest level if that was appropriate. But from that time, from when the Maastricht Treaty came into force, which would have been finally, I believe, 1994, until 2010, I think from then as well, there's been not one item under the subsidiarity principle where the European Commission has said, yes, we won't make this decision, we'll hand it to member states. Not one. There's been not one appeal to the European Court of Justice where a country has said, under subsidiarity, we should be making this decision, not the European Union. So there's something concrete in the EU rules which sounds ever so good, but in practice it doesn't work. But he can do something similar again and hopefully try and, well, in his mind, fool the people. And of course, in a referendum, there's always the tendency to say for people to vote yes and to support the status quo. I mentioned it earlier, staying in the European Union is the status quo option. It's the non-change option. It's arguably, in some people's mind, the safer option. And of course, people also want to say yes to things. Often, that's what people do in a referendum. And of course, it's no surprise that the referendum question will be, do you want Britain to stay in the European Union? Yes. It's not, do you want Britain to be an independent country, which would favour us? It's, do you want Britain to stay inside the European Union? Now, that could make up a small percentage, which may be enough. Now, this is just a chart, just to show it's just not me talking about how there's soft support and how this middle way alternative is the most popular. There we see an opinion poll, 52% saying they would support leaving the European Union, 30% saying they'd stay in. It goes up and down, but it can be often quite close. Change your question, and is it to negotiating and remaining in the European Union? That 30% goes up to 57% wanting to stay in the European Union, and coming out goes down from 52% to 36%. It radically changes things. If, of course, actually to 22% makes things even worse for us. If David Cameron or whoever can pretend that they've changed Britain's relationship with the European Union, that puts us in a very difficult position. So really we do have our work cut out. Now, I'd argue there is a way that gets round this, and that's to frame the debate, as I mentioned earlier, the EU or EFTA. Which would you prefer to be a member of? My organisation, the Bruges Group, we did an opinion poll based on that, and we found that it adds 20%. If you change the tone of the debate, reframing the debate, it's called, from saying leaving the EU or staying in the EU to one of leaving the EU and rejoining the European Free Trade Association, that adds 20% to the case wanting out. It makes it 71% who say that they would want to leave. And that's across all political parties. Even the Liberal Democrats largely favour that option, and just 29% would want to stay in the European Union. So really the alternative of Britain leaving but remaining in the European Economic Area as a transitional arrangement and rejoining the European Free Trade Association, which are feasible, really does change the nature of the debate. It gives us, I think, that margin that we will need to win and overcome all the fear, uncertainty and doubt that will be thrown at the Eurosceptics. Now, that's my favoured option, keeping the single market and renegotiating, changing aspects of that, finally abolishing that. I know, as I mentioned earlier, Richard North is working on the more advanced plans, but some people favour the Swiss option. Personally, I think there's a number of problems with that. It's based on 120 bilateral agreements. We want out of the European Union quickly. To negotiate 120 bilateral agreements between Britain and the European Union will take decades. Switzerland took a decade to negotiate it. We want out quicker than that, and we wanted to have our businesses having access to the EU single market without such a complex, time-consuming arrangement that may never even be agreed. Now, even the EU finds their relationship with Switzerland too bureaucratic. That's how bad it is. It's based on 15 different committees. There's a lack of mutual recognition. So if a good is produced in Switzerland, it can't be sold within the European Union unless it complies to EU standards. There's an example of this. The European Union's REACH directive that wasn't applied in Switzerland. Chemicals were produced there that didn't comply with the REACH directive. They weren't allowed to be sold. At the moment, countries that are part of the European Economic Area have the right to sell their goods throughout the rest of the European Economic Area, regardless of the standards. It doesn't have to comply with each country's standards or the EU's because of this principle. That doesn't apply to Switzerland. The Swiss arrangement does not give the EU access to the single market in services. As I mentioned earlier, it will take many years to agree. And of course, the big problem for that is that the Swiss option is not favoured by the EU. So we could argue in a referendum, we want to come out of the EU and have the Swiss type arrangement, and then the EU just turns around and says, no, we're not doing that, we're not going there. Just like Alex Salmond in Scotland said, we're going to come out of the UK, or they still sometimes pretended that Scotland would remain in the United Kingdom, but of course he then said, we'll keep the pound, we'll have a currency union. Britain said, or the other British leaders said, no, that's not going to happen. Cut him off at the legs. Said, well, we'll join the European Union. Even Barroso said on the Andrew Marr show, no, Scotland would not be, it would be impossible, nearly impossible for Scotland to join the European Union. Another plank of his campaign had gone, and he had produced a 630-page document of his exit plan, with actually the Scottish Government, which was meant to answer those questions, the two biggest points in it, the currency union, EU membership, over. That's the point. He had effectively lost the referendum. The same thing could happen to us. We can set out our perfect scenario that we want to achieve with Brussels, but of course if they're not going to play ball or criticise it and say it's not tenable, then of course we would be losing a main plank of our campaign. There's another option, the Turkish option, as it's known, that would be remaining in the EU's customs union. At the moment, Britain is a member of the European Union, of course, and automatically a part of its customs union. That means the EU's trade policy is our trade policy, but it's also, in terms of industrial goods, Turkey's trade policy. That's really not an option. Some people have been advocating it, but Turkey no longer supports it because Turkey has to apply EU rules in industrial goods if it wants to sell into the European Union. Also, as a part of the customs union, a country can have a trade agreement with the European Union and then sell directly into Turkey, tariff-free, but of course it doesn't apply the other way round. If Turkey can then not sell to that third country tariff-free and has to negotiate its own agreement, which then has to be agreed by the European Union, it finds that very one-sided. Again, there's the lack of mutual recognition unless, of course, they adopt EU standards, which they must do. And, of course, the customs union does not allow for other trade agreements to be reached. And one major reason why we want to leave the European Union is we feel that there's other opportunities around the world that we should explore. Being part of the customs union means your trade policy would be dictated to by Brussels, so that's not an option. So what I propose, the way forward, is that we'd leave the political union, but keep economic links. So I think that's just you can argue about the quality of that, but that's a sort of strapline that we can present our case as, that we don't totally, it's not a radical change that will be happening, that we would be keeping those economic ties. I think that's what most people would be happy with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, rejoining the European Free Trade Association, that means realigning with Switzerland, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. That gives full access to the single market, because we can legally retain our European Economic Area membership or single market membership. Some people don't like the single market, but of course it's become totemic in British politics. It's like the National Health Service. There's a lot of problems with it, but try criticising it. It's fundamentally important to a host of people. The single market is the same. There's many problems with it. We know that, but of course we think it's absolutely fundamental that it's retained, and politicians are wedded to that idea, and so are many people. Now, being in the European Economic Area, that's often described as there being keeping the four freedoms. That's the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital and persons. But actually under the EEA agreement it is actually possible to restrict immigration. Now little Liechtenstein uses Articles 112 and 113 of the EEA agreement. You don't have to memorise them. And a special Protocol 15 of the EEA agreement to restrict residency into Liechtenstein. So it is possible under the EEA agreement to restrict immigration. So we can take some measures, but of course ultimately it is just a transitional arrangement, but it is possible to restrict immigration in a certain way under the EEA agreement. We don't have to be fully open like we are at the moment. That would need some discussion, but the possibility is there. Liechtenstein does it, and I mentioned earlier about the four freedoms of the single market, one of them being capital. Now of course Iceland, when it had its financial crash, imposed capital controls. That is against the EEA agreement, but it did so because under the EEA agreement we would not be subject to the European Court of Justice. We would be an independent nation. We would have an agreement that we're meant to abide by, but we can't be dictated to by an EU institution like the European Court of Justice. And I've mentioned it guarantees a trade and encourages investment. It allows the right to make own trade agreements, and the majority of EEA relevant rules are actually determined above the EU. So we could exit the European Union and we would still need to comply with around 80% of EEA relevant rules because they originate from above the EU with treaty organisations such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which we've already agreed to abide by various regulations which are of a technical standard and are there to harmonise things to, well, they believe that it encourages more trade. There's many benefits of the EEA and EFTA membership. They can fully engage with the UN standard setting organisations. At the moment, Britain has to comply to the EU position. We would have our own voice in those bodies. They even have input into the development of EU law. Norway, which is not in the European Union, is a member of the EEA as well as EFTA, and that gives them access to the policy groups of the European Union, and they've actually been described by the OECD as a leader in the formulation of EU environmental law. That's not something I think that Britain can claim, but the EU is influenced very heavily by Norway, which is again not a member, so in fact we could be maximising our influence over what remains our largest export market by actually leaving the EU, but keeping access to the policy shaping working groups of the EEA. And another example about Norway as well, Norway wanted changes in maritime law. It lobbied the International Maritime Organisation, which then dictated some standards which the EU applied. So it's another way that Norway works the international system a lot better than Britain does, or Britain can even do so from within the European Union. An example of and a main benefit of EFTA EEA is that it's an off-the-shelf, already in existence alternative. Britain can move into it quite quickly. There would still need to be some discussions, but can relatively quite quickly, rather than dreaming up some new relationship or some new organisation or some new special deal just for Britain, which would take many years to agree, because there's not actually a case in history of the EU reaching a trade agreement with another country in less than 10 years. It takes sometimes decades to agree. TTIP, the agreement with the United States, has been under consideration since the 90s. I don't think it'll ever be agreed because there's just too many problems, too many vested interests. But that's why, if we're going to leave the European Union, we need to move into an off-the-shelf arrangement, and we can then take it from there. Of course, being in EFTA, we'd be outside the EU foreign policy, outside of the European Defence Agency, outside of the CAP, the CFP, Justice and Home Affairs, and also there's a number of financial regulators which are threatening the City of London. They have the power to shut down a financial institution. They don't apply to EEA, to EFTA EEA countries. They don't have power over financial services. The agencies don't, I know, in countries like Norway. So Britain could be out of the European Union, free access to their single market in services, but at the same time free from the worst of the EU financial regulators. And the European Commission itself, it's not just me saying that, oh, if Britain can cancel its EU membership, remain in the European Economic Area via EFTA. The European Commission has actually said that EFTA EEA can offer countries a convenient alternative to EU membership status on an a la carte basis. What British politicians are continually saying is that, such as David Cameron in his Bloomberg speech, he wants Britain to be part of the single market, but on an a la carte basis. That was essentially what he was saying, and he's arguing that doing that from within the European Union. That's nonsense. You can't do it from within the EU. The EU cannot be renegotiated with so that a country is an EU member but can pick and choose EU laws. But EFTA EEA states can. They can have access to the single market, which is, as I mentioned earlier, totemic, and they can do so on an a la carte basis. They do have the right to reject EU rules, and of course and to pick their own level of association with the European Union. Countries like Norway want to chart a course that's quite similar to the European Union. Britain, of course, would want to move in a different direction and extricate itself from more than 40 years of membership. EFTA EEA is the way forward. There's more benefits, there's less regulation, save Britain at least 3 billion a year. I estimate it'd add 30 billion to our GDP each year, may even be higher. We have the right to reject, modify rules that are relevant to the EEA. EFTA countries have lower unemployment. That's something I think that's very positive, because we can say, what is the future for Britain? What would it be like? And we could point towards Norway that has, and Switzerland that have around 3% unemployment. Half the level we have in the UK and just a fraction of what it is in the European Union. So it gives us clear points to differentiate our campaign and show what the future would be like. Also, countries like Norway and Switzerland, they're very well governed. They've also got strong, vibrant democracies. So we're aligning with the right side. You know, we can present a choice. It can continue aligning ourselves with the failure of the European Union, which remains in a deep economic mire, or we can be aligning ourselves with countries that have vibrant, open, democratic societies that have much lower unemployment. So it could even create 1 million jobs by that same rationale. They have a trade balance with the EU. Of course, the UK has a 40 billion deficit. Norway's in surplus. The accounts of the European Union have never been cleared without clarification. EFTA has signed off every year without any difficulties. This is just to show that I've done my homework. This is about foreign direct investment. Europhiles claim that if we left the European Union, this would dry up. Actually, FDI to the EFTA states double what it is to the European Economic Area states. We would get more inward investment. Why? Well, we'd have less regulations, we would be able to have a more open economy, plus of course we would keep full access to the largest single market in terms of GDP in the world, 500 million consumers, which make up the current 28 EU states. And this is just showing that it's, again, another graph, just to show I've done my homework, is that, again, it's another way of looking at FDI towards Iceland, Switzerland and Norway, and that with the UK, they're doing a lot better, and it really started to take off when, of course, the EEA agreement came into force in 1994. Then they really did begin to separate. And that's even if you take out Switzerland's financial services or Norway's gas, they're still doing better than us. So it shows that Britain can be a positive, open economy if we're outside of the European Union. And this again shows how things have really taken off for the EFTA states ever since they entered into an agreement with the European Union. Again, another example of how Britain could be getting more foreign direct investment in our economy by being outside of the European Union, but a member of the European Free Trade Association and remaining in the European Economic Area. This just shows what it's like in terms of payments. Currently, Britain at the moment is paying £243 a year to the EU gross. But of course that figure would be slashed if Britain were to leave the EU and remain in the European Economic Area. There would still be some payments known as Norway grants. These are to the least well-off countries in the EU to deal with the disparities in the single market, but there would be a financial saving for the taxpayer, and I'm happy to send people these figures. You don't need to necessarily remember them all now, but I'm happy to send them around, all the information about the data which backs up my case. Now, here's an interesting graph. We have the UK and EFTA exports to the EEC from 1974 to 1992. The UK was, of course, doing better than the EFTA 3. That would be Switzerland, Norway and Iceland doing significantly better until 1992. What changed after 1992? There was the creation of the single market, which came into force on the 1st of January 1993. After that, things changed dramatically. The EFTA countries overtaken the UK in the value per capita of their exports to the rest of the European Union. So that just goes to show that those countries that decided not to join the European Union but remain in EFTA and have trade access via to the single market had benefited much more than those in the European Union. So we've got data to back up our case. And this is EFTA's trade links around the world. A country that's in EFTA could make its own trade agreement, such as Iceland is in EFTA, yet they were the first country in Europe to make a trade deal with China. They did so on their own. Switzerland was, of course, the second and only other country in Europe that has a trade agreement with China. That's not an EFTA agreement, that is their own arrangement, which they've done directly, but EFTA itself does have trade deals around the world, many of which are in negotiations. They have ones undergoing with Russia at the moment, and of course India is a very important one. The European Union has been negotiating a trade deal with India for many years. That's been in abeyance since 2011. There's just no ability to reach an agreement because there's a lot of complex issues that need to be discussed. EFTA is much more advanced. If Britain wants to take advantage of a trade agreement with India, we're better off doing that by leaving the European Union and joining EFTA, and of course then using their skills and their willingness to reach agreements, have an agreement, have a trade deal with India, which is one of the world's largest economies and very significant. Of course, TTIP, which I mentioned earlier, I don't think it'll ever come into force. There's a lot wrong with it. but it can apply to EEA states. So the European Union has been using a trade deal with America as a reason for the European Union, as a reason why countries should stay in the EU, but of course countries outside can also take part in it if indeed we do want that to happen. This just goes to show, you don't need to read this, but this is how I view the EEA as a transitional arrangement. Currently the UK is in the EU, and there's a lot of problems with that. There's some good sides in terms of the free movement of goods, services and capital. The WTO option is another one, but that has its own problems. EFTA, I see, has nothing but pluses in the short term. Of course, we wouldn't want it as a long-term arrangement because we think we could achieve something better with other European countries. But of course, as a transition, it answers all the questions that the other side will present to us about problems with trade. It just goes to show more of the plus points as I see them, which I'll happily send around. Now, as I mentioned earlier, leaving the European Union isn't just the end of the matter, and neither is replacing our EU membership with that of the European Free Trade Association and keeping full access to the single market. It's actually the beginning of a process. I mentioned earlier that Richard North is working on the plans that would come next. I'm discussing them with him and amongst other people. So it's a beginning, and I see it as the fulfilment of British foreign policy from Elizabeth I to 1960. Britain's policy when it came to Europe was always to make sure that Europe wouldn't be ruled by one power. That was the case when with Elizabeth I against the Habsburgs, the case with of one Churchill against Louis XIV, the fight against Napoleon, Wilhelminian Germany and Hitler. Of course, that was always our policy, to make sure that the continent of Europe was not governed essentially by one power. That was the case until 1960, when Britain led in the setting up of the European Free Trade Association, which was a counterweight to the European Union. It was for those countries that didn't want to join the EU, and that for a time it was very successful. There were 6 countries in the EEC in 1960, and there was 7 in EFTA. EFTA was actually bigger and stronger, but Britain from 1962 onwards changed policy and thought that needed to get involved and support the idea of the continent of Europe being governed by one power. We should revert back to our previous policy and make the case for a vibrant EFTA that can be a counterweight to the European Union and to lead to a realignment of power on the continent of Europe. At the moment, some EFTA countries, it is true, are a bit pushed around by the EU as partly their political class, which is happy to do so, but Britain joining with other EFTA states will make them feel much bolder, will really change the dynamic of how things work on the continent. And in time, the EEA agreement needs to be replaced with a new international settlement, where of course there would be parity, arguably, hopefully, the European Union being abolished, because there was a poll in Denmark that said most Danish people would actually prefer to be members of EFTA than the European Union. We are not alone in this. We're certainly not alone in our struggle against the European Union. We're certainly not alone also in terms of where we see our country going next once we're out of the European Union. And we do need to argue to have those arguments, because if we're going to win a referendum, we really need to show what the future will hold for us. And the first thing upon leaving would be that we'd rejoin the European Free Trade Association. I'm happy for any questions.
Can I get a copy of this presentation?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll give you my details and give me an email and I'll send it straight to you.
So if you have sent your email addresses to John Bentley, at the end of our meeting in Derby, we circulated the papers and Robert's presentation to all the members for whom we had email addresses.
With the Europeans living in this country, by 2017, there'll be a lot more, and they'll be allowed to vote in the referendum?
Well, if there's to be a referendum, then it would be up to us who can vote in it. Currently, there was a bill going through Parliament which is going to be reintroduced on Friday, The original James Wharton bill for referendum had it that only British citizens could vote in that referendum. At the moment, there's on the electoral register, there's people from the European Union, and they can vote in local elections and so council elections and European elections. They can't vote in a general election. That's only for British citizens and Irish citizens as well, and those from the Commonwealth. So basically, in the referendum proposals as it stands, Europeans cannot vote or would not be allowed to vote. It would only be for British and Irish citizens.
I asked Nigel Farage only last month, and he said yes, they could vote in the referendum, European citizens.
That's not my understanding. Well, it's probably. Yeah, in James Wharton bills had it just as British citizens.
I checked that one up and I agree with you, Robert.
Yeah.
I also checked with the Electoral Commission and they said we can't tell you because it will depend on the terms of the referendum bill.
Yeah. Yes. Of course, if there were to be a government that was really strongly against us and would do everything they could to make sure we lose it, then of course they would make sure that hundreds of thousands of Poles and whatever could have the chance to vote.
I've canvassed an area, and on the electoral register was a man from Chile. So he was inclined not to vote, but I'm certain if he wanted to vote, he could have voted.
I was concerned about this point, and I had a letter back from, I think it was the Cabinet Office, and saying as currently stands they wouldn't vote. But I did notice during the Wharton debate that Labour particularly were pushing this point.
Yeah, it's something we need to keep an eye on. Ian, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for hosting us today here.
Thank you. I'm not entirely convinced by this EFTA argument. I hope you don't mind putting an alternative or a bit of doubt into it. Iceland is no bigger than Bristol. Yes. Norway is smaller than London. The economy of EFTA all put together is small compared with the UK. Is it really realistic to say we're going to join it? I mean, it's just so tiny.
Well,
can I just get another couple of points in while I can? The issue about 3 million jobs is kind of taking a back seat now. And what the burning issue for the British public is the immigration issue. That's really shot up on people's agenda. The EEA at the moment requires us to take free movement of peoples. It hasn't taken place. No negotiation that you've mentioned about with Liechtenstein, using those articles 112, 113, etc. That hasn't happened. So how could we possibly go into a referendum to offer the British people a lovely off-the-shelf arrangement with this tiny, tiny economy that we're going to totally dominate, saying that, oh yes, we won't have any problem with free movement of peoples either because we'll negotiate that all the way.
Yeah.
It hasn't been negotiated at the time of the referendum. You don't know the outcome of that negotiation. So it's not realistic, is it?
Well, about the used to be the case that there was more countries in EFTA than in the EEC. Now, a number of my colleagues have had discussions, such as you probably know Hugo van Randwick. He often goes over to EFTA to meet with them. They will have us as a member, so long as we join the European Economic Area, which we're already a member of. They will be willing to accept us as a member of EFTA. And of course, we need to remember that those EFTA countries, they may be small countries, but per GDP per capita, they're way better off than we are. They are far better off. So we have many similarities. We have oil. Norway has oil. We have a chemicals industry, so does Switzerland, who also has a financial services industry. We have a lot in common. We also have the richest fishing grounds in Europe. Of course, that is another similarity that we have with Iceland and Norway. We have a lot in common. Yes, we are the bigger party, but this is something we should be looking forward to. We'd actually be leading in an organisation for the first time. It was Harold Wilson's original idea that Britain, or Harold Macmillan rather, that Britain would lead in this new sort of federal Europe that was emerging. That was never the case, as we know. This is something where we can take leadership in, and we really can change things. So they would be willing to have us as a member, and we can make very significant changes to the whole balance of power within the European Economic Area. You're right that immigration is a big issue, but of course when there's the scare stories about people losing their jobs, people will be very worried, and we need to answer those questions, but it will give us more latitude. At the moment, we can't really do much about immigration. If we try and differentiate between British citizens and citizens from other EU states, that's against EU law. We would be able to do so within the European Economic Area because there we wouldn't be dictated to by the European Court of Justice. If there were an instance where we weren't abiding by the EEA agreement, there's an EFTA court, and that can say, Britain, you're not following the agreement. There's no powers to tell us to force any change at all. Then there's no expulsion from the European Economic Area. So there are ways that Britain can take action against immigration whilst being an EEA member. Now, would we, for instance, want to stop all the French people that are going into work in London, which is now the biggest, the fourth biggest French city in the world, and of course supporting the City of London largely? I'd argue that we'd want to think very carefully about that. But we can take more, we have more latitude to deal with immigration as an EFTA EEA member than as an EU member. As an EU member, we have next to no latitude, but these articles already exist and can be taken, can be used as the safeguarding clauses. If we think that, if we think that the immigration is too much, then we can impose those articles if we were so minded as safeguarding clauses. And we can do so, we would have that right. Now, it's not the final story. As I mentioned, it's not the end, it's the beginning. But of course, if we're going to leave the European Union, then we would need to show that trade is protected. There is no other feasible argument that can guarantee that trade links with the European Union and beyond would be kept. There's no way of guaranteeing it, and they're quite easily defeated. So yes, we can't get exactly what we want in terms of necessarily stopping all immigrants, but we can take more action. And of course, it would be a process of change and renegotiation. But I think that I'm quite positive that we can do so. And of course, if Liechtenstein can do it, then so can we. Neil.
The issue of immigration, I would just say it has nothing to do with the EU, obviously would be not the right comment to make. But having said that, you cure immigration by solving the push and pull factors. I mean, Richard North has written about this a lot. And, you know, it's the fact that we're an attractive place to come that makes people come, which is entirely an internal matter that our own government should be addressing in its own right. You know, the paying of benefits is not an EU requirement. I mean, there are various things that we should be doing to restrict immigration for ourselves. It actually has nothing to do with the EU.
Immigration, of course, is an issue. There is clear evidence that massive immigration, for those at the bottom end of the income scale, has led to a depreciation of wages. But of course, there's bigger immigration issues. At this moment in time, I'm personally more worried about immigration from certain Muslim countries. It's not all Muslims, of course, but from certain Muslim countries have very severe difficulties. That's what if we're going to talk about immigration, that's what we need to be making sure that we're safe from. Making sure that there's people who are not extremists coming to this country, people who are causing absolute havoc in the Middle East at this moment. That is possibly more alarming than the Polish migratory workers, but we would be able to take more action. And some East Europeans are not in favour of immigration. The Bulgarian ambassador mentioned on the Daily Politics about a year ago now about how he was very worried about a brain drain from Bulgaria to the UK. They are not necessarily in favour of losing the best and brightest to this country. So if immigration it helps large multinational, large corporations, those at the top end of the income scale that will then have cheaper labour will arguably benefit, but the people from those countries are not actually necessarily being helped by coming here. And if we were to have an agreement that would restrict access to the UK from the poorest countries, which I think could well be feasible, then that would be something that we would be happy with and that those countries would also find enticing as well.
We also have to bear in mind as a counterweight that there's a substantial British migration Is it about 2 million people?
Yes, currently 1.8 million British citizens live in Europe. Now, if there's a referendum, of course, they would actually still have, if we left the European Union, they would keep the right to live in that country because they're executing their rights under an existing treaty. If that treaty is cancelled, it doesn't then mean that your rights under that treaty have gone. So the Polish person or Romanian person that's come here as a result of the treaties with the European Union, they wouldn't automatically have to go back the day we're out. They would have their right to come here. So it wouldn't mean that we'd be able to prevent new people coming here, but it wouldn't actually automatically get rid of people who've already come here, nor would it get rid of people who have British people that have gone abroad to, say, Spain, for instance, or the south of France, or could be working in any other, or living indeed in any other European state. But of course, if there were to be a referendum, these 1.8 million people may well be worried about their position, and they will be phoning home, just like Scottish people living in England were phoning their relatives saying, vote to keep the Union together. They would no doubt be trying to keep the European Union together because they naturally would fear any change, and not many people know about the issue of executed rights under international law. That's not something that many people are familiar with, and people...
There was correspondence about that in the English language Spanish press whilst I was there a few weeks ago, saying what's going to happen to us.
Yeah.
I wrote us.
So the immigration issue is a double-edged sword, and it is something that we do need to be mindful of. But I'd argue that being a member of EFTA EEA is better than being a member of the European Union. I think this can get us out of the EU. It answers most of the questions that will be thrown at us. And yes, it is not a panacea. It's not the answer to all our problems with the European Union, but let's say, for instance, it's 70% better. Now, 70% of something is better than 100% of nothing. If we lose the referendum, we're done for a generation. It's game over, especially if that, So let's get out the EU, keep the European Economic Area, and then replace that. But of course, a lot of Eurosceptics talk about, sorry, I'll be with you very shortly, John, talk about a free trade agreement with the European Union. The free trade, or the trade agreements between the EU and Switzerland, includes the free movement of people. The trade agreement between the EU and Ukraine has easier visa access for Ukrainians to come into the European Union. Many of the trade deals that the EU do are wedded to the condition that there would be easier movement. In case of Switzerland, free movement. So we can have some latitude of action under an EEA type of agreement, which would in time be replaced, and there would be no one to necessarily stop us. Or we could have possibly even less latitude under a free trade agreement, such as what Switzerland has. So really, there's many different things to consider, and yes, it doesn't answer all the questions straight away, but it will help us win any referendum. John?
On this whole immigration subject, I mean, one of the things, I think you personally have done a lot to win me round to this. Because it's essentially a two-stage exit with EEA/EFTA.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's an intermediate step. But the thing that really won me over was what you were saying about Liechtenstein and the ability to restrict immigration. But what you're saying, I can see it, is essentially we would present, well, look, we can restrict immigration as part of EEA/EFTA. We can't as part of the EU. And I can, people who've thought about it through and who are on the ball can say, well, fair enough, that's a good halfway house. Perhaps when we get the final exit, plan, or stage 2, or whatever it's called, then we can have a much, much tighter, Australian, Canadian, or even tighter immigration. This is my personal support to back, quite frankly. I'm not ashamed to admit it. But, I recognise that I would be prepared to vote for something that would be a halfway house. But how can you get someone who would express even more strongly than I've just done, send a lot back, and then be saying, well, look, I want to get rid of these people, but you're out of the EU with this option. means there's still going to be 2 million Poles here. I mean, why are we not flying?
Well, they arguably they would still be,
Yeah.
those Poles that have already come here would still be here under the executed right of executed rights under a treaty.
They won't want to vote for ours.
Well, I suspect that people who are vehemently anti-immigration, of very good reason, would vote for us anyway. We've got those votes in the bag. If we're going to have a referendum, we need 50% plus one. We can motivate our 25, 30% to definitely turn out, but we need more than that. So in the immigration argument has helped us a lot. Arguably, we need a little bit more to push us over that mark of 50% plus one, and some people won't necessarily support a stronger line on immigration. So you always have to have a balance. I remember in the 2005 general election, Michael Howard went very hard on the issue of immigration, and he played into Tony Blair's hands. Of course, this was a different time in this country, but he pushed hard on the issue of immigration, and the Labour strategy was to let him until, of course, he went too far, and in the end he did, and then was attacked as being racist. So that's something that we want to be careful of. But I would say we've got the immigration votes in the bag. We can promise them some degree of action as an EFTA EEA member, more than what we can give under the EU. So we can placate them, but we also need to win over the other side, who may have less desire to respond to an argument based purely on immigration.
Because the other side, of course, there are some people who do support withdrawal who want to keep the free movement.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And of course, some people, will be very concerned about immigration, but also they like easy access to going on holiday to the EU. Personally, I fly straight over it and go somewhere else. But some people want to restrict access to our country, but we're very happy to having access to other people's. So it's a double-sided argument. And so far, economy and immigration are the two biggest issues, but it's something we need firmer arguments on, and we're developing those at the moment. But it's not the only issue. Sorry, this gentleman was first.
On the subject of immigration, it's been quoted widely that we've got 2 million people living abroad. And I'd put it that most of those people are either on pensions from this country or are working. I would imagine only a small amount of people abroad are not in work. Whilst on the other side of the coin, here in Bristol, we've got an African country, I won't mention the name. We've got 13,000 people, of which 75% of the men are out of work and 90% of the women are out of work. Now I'm saying that is where we get an imbalance, because those people abroad are contributing, but it's costing us a lot. At £20,000 a family, and there's 13,000 people, it's costing us an awful lot. There's an imbalance there.
I don't know what community you're talking about. I know in my area there's a big deal of deprivation regarding Somalis. It might be exactly they're doing very poorly. Some people from other ethnic groups come here and do exceedingly well. Somalis are doing very badly, but of course we could do something about immigration from Somalia now. Of course, there's international treaties which we do have to respect under the EU, such as rights of asylum, but at the moment, we have less latitude to deal with immigration, but free movement from Eastern Europe will not change the position of the Somalis. That's something we could in theory do now, and could definitely do once we're outside of the EU. So that is an issue, but that's not something that's caused directly by the European Union. Of course, we do have to follow certain EU standards on treating asylum seekers. That was brought in via the Lisbon Treaty and the European Court of Human Rights, which we have to respect as being an EU member. But once we're out of the EU, being an EFTA EEA member, we can even, I believe we can take a stronger line against Eastern European immigrants, for instance, or those from Southern Europe fleeing the economic crisis there. But of course, we would definitely 100% have far more latitude to deal with people from developing nations or failed states like Somalia, which has been wrecked by a war since the early 90s. So I'm very confident we would be able to deal with those issues much stronger.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
This is a lovely scenario, I'm very interested in it, but for the stumbling block of getting a royal prerogative, even if we are so fortunate as to get the result of a referendum in our favour, I can't see that the powers in Westminster, they could hold back from producing a royal prerogative. Is there any other scheme, any other way of being able to get this to happen?
Oh, that would be joining EFTA, rejoining EFTA and remaining in the European Economic Area. That can happen quite simply. To rejoin EFTA, we would need an Act of Parliament, but
we can't do at the moment.
We can't do at the moment. Of course, at the moment, there's a majority of MPs and peers who are in favour of keeping Britain in the European Union. Presumably, if we won a referendum, they would pass an Act of Parliament that would take us out of the European Union. At the moment,
I think we've got to look at that quite seriously to see whether.
Yes, yeah. That in a sense, that would be a given. We can withdraw via the Article 50 method, which Parliament itself, which means a vote passed in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, achieving the royal assent, which some argue happens automatically, can then give the notice that we want to leave the European Union, or it could cancel the European Communities Act 1972 and its later amendments, although that creates certain difficulties. But under Article 50, that's just showing that as a result of the Lisbon Treaty passing through Parliament in 2007, a country can give its notice to withdraw quite simply. All I have to do is write to the President of the European Council saying we want out. A country can very easily get out of the European Union and start the Article 50 process. It is very straightforward. The royal prerogative is a number of things, such as a country has a right to declare war, also the right to conduct diplomacy. Arguably, this falls into the diplomacy category, and any way we like, through either be an Act of Parliament or through the government collectively saying we want out of the European Union, can begin the whole process of getting out. So it is straightforward, us leaving. Of course, at the moment, the biggest stumbling block is that the government is not on side, neither are a majority of MPs or peers. But presumably, if there was a referendum, people they would respect that, and certainly we would make them, or they would receive our pitchforks up their posteriors rather quickly. Yeah.
It's all very well having the referendum, but we've seen how referenda in other parts of Europe, if they produce the wrong answer, means that they can renege on any decision. Government could renege or delay any decision without acknowledging the results.
Just let them try and see what we'll do, and that will become very entertaining. If they were to be a referendum and they were to ignore that, it would be very, very bad for them indeed.
Can I ask for a long that? So just suppose this may be a long shot of a scenario, but I don't think impossible. Suppose in however many weeks' time, Mark Reckless wins in Rochester and Scrooge. A lot of Tory MPs really push the panic buttons. Cameron is forced to resign, and inevitably his leader, to win the consent of the party, his successor would have to be someone who was pretty openly withdrawalist if they're going to get the support of the Tory rank and file. How would that affect, and if the Tory party found itself led by someone who was at least a moderate withdrawalist, say Owen Patterson's name I keep hearing bandied around, how would that affect the attempt to pull those people's eyes, would you say?
I think that would be a help. If it doesn't necessarily matter so much who the individuals are. Of course, Owen Patterson is way sounder on Europe than David Cameron. David Cameron, having been forced into this issue, into the positions he has out of necessity to keep his career alive. I don't doubt that, and is actually naturally inclined to be pro-EU. I actually think that it would make a big difference, because then the government would have to follow if the government is a Eurosceptic one, because of course there's collective responsibility. It's not just the Prime Minister, it's also the ministers as well, but the Prime Minister has a right to appoint those ministers. If that was then a purely Eurosceptic, or properly Eurosceptic government, then they would instruct the civil servants. They are, just like Alex Salmond used the state in Scotland to produce arguments for staying in for leaving the UK, that would then enable the government to use the state to produce literature that would be in favour of Britain coming out and developing or further developing the exit plans that some of us are putting together or helping to put together at the moment. So it would be a very big change, and arguably we don't actually need a referendum to leave the European Union. It's almost, there's been so much talk about referendums that it's almost become accepted, but there's nothing constitutional that says we need a referendum. It can either be an Act of Parliament or giving notice under Article 50. It can be a number of ways, but it would be a big change. But yeah, if there was a change at the top, that could be interesting. But it could be a situation that someone even, someone Europhile may replace David Cameron. We just don't know.
We've just spoken to our host, Ian, and given Article 50 notice to commence the preparation of tea.
Yeah.
As I think that Robert has been grilled for a good long time, but it's a sort of discussion which we can continue afterwards, or as long as
over tea. Yeah, over tea. Yes.
Or over tea. So we'll
adjourn for tea.
Yeah. Thank you.